Chapter 12. Mad Mr. Melvin. Mr. Melvin was furious. He marched into the office and turned on the school intercom. "George Beard and Harold Hutchins," he shouted over the loudspeakers. "Meet Mr. Mr. Krupp in the school library right now." "We have a library?" said George. After about 20 minutes of searching, George and Harold finally came across a room that they had never seen before. They entered cautiously, stepping quietly past rows and rows of empty bookshelves until they met up with Mr. Melvin. "I told you guys to give me a cool name and not to make me look stupid," Mr. Melvin screamed, clutching their comic book in his sweaty hand. "Oops," said George. "I thought you said to give you a stupid name and not to make you look cool." "Yeah," said Harold. "It was an honest misunderstanding." Mr. Melvin threw the comic book to the ground, then led George and Harold over to the purple potty. "Remember when I had that great idea to build a time machine?" asked Mr. Melvin. "Actually," said George, "that was my—" "Well, here it is," Mr. Melvin interrupted triumphantly, "and you two smarty pantses are going to test it out for me." "Huh?" said Harold. "I'm sending you kids back in time to the day before yesterday," Mr. Melvin said. "And you better not return until you've got my Combinatron 2000. "Cool," said George. "I've always wanted to travel through time." Mr. Melvin had a great deal of instructions for George and Harold before they left on their journey. And though the instructions were quite boring, it would have benefited the boys if they had paid attention instead of switching the letters around on a nearby bulletin board. Mr. Melvin spoke at the length about the workings of the time machine and the proper etiquette of time travel. "You must be very careful that nobody sees you on your journey," Mr. Melvin said. "If they do, just zap them with my new invention, the Forgetchamacallit 2000. Check out our school's big internet website at www.jhes.com. This will erase everything in their short-term memory, and they won't remember ever seeing you." Mr. Melvin had also built a fake Combinatron 2000 to switch with the real one. Finally, Mr. Melvin gave George and Harold a very important warning. "Whatever you do, it is very important that you don't use this time machine 2 days in a row. It needs to cool off every other day, or else it might open up a positive-dimensional reality rift that could destroy the entire planet." George and Harold started laughing at their new message on the bulletin board. "Hey!" Mr. Melvin shouted. "Have you kids even heard one word I've said?" Yeah, said George. "We gotta switch the thing with the thingy. And if anybody sees us," said Harold, "we'll zap them with the witchamajiggy." "Don't worry, we got it," said George. "We shake our big butts when we swim in the toilet." George and Harold stepped into the purple potty as Mr. Melvin closed the door behind them. Harold set the controller for the day before yesterday. Then George pulled the chain. Suddenly, there was a brilliant flash of green light, and the purple potty disappeared. Chapter 13. The day before yesterday. After a few moments of flashing lights, everything became quiet. Harold opened the potty door and peeked out into the darkened library. Cautiously, the two time travelers stepped to the library window and looked out. There they saw Melvin's father, Mr. Sneedley, zapping the bionic booger boy with a blast from the Combinatron 2000. "Been there," said George. "Done that," said Harold. In the corner, George and Harold found a coat and a hat which belonged to Miss Singerbrains. Immediately, they thought of a plan. Harold put on the coat and hat and climbed onto George's shoulders. "I sure hope this disguise works," said Harold. "It better," said George. "We can't risk them letting them recognize us." Soon George and Harold were at the scene of the action. Mr. Sneedley had just fired the Combinatron 2000 a second time, and now the boys were ready to make their move. Excuse me, Mr. Sneedley," said Harold, trying very hard to sound like a grown-up. "I'd like to present unto you the most brilliantest science guy of the whole wide world award." "Really?" cried Mr. Sneedley. "It's always been my dream to win that award." "But first," said Harold, "I'd like to have a look at that Combino thingy." "Okay," said Mr. Sneedley. He handed Harold the Combinatron 2000 and smiled proudly. Said Harold, "I need to look at it behind those bushes over there." Harold and George wobbled over to the bushes, unbuttoned their coat, and switched the two Combinatrons. Then they wobbled back and handed the fake Combinatron 2000 to Mr. Sneedley. Everything seems to be in order," said Harold, "but before you present the award, we'd like to get a photo of you." "Who's we?" asked Mr. Sneedley. I'd like to get a photo of you," said Harold nervously. George stuck his hand out of the coat and held up the Forgetchumcallit 2000. "Say cheese," said Harold. Mr. Sneedley looked down in shock at George's hand. Then George pressed the button. Flash! Suddenly, Mr. Sneedley forgot everything that just happened. Dazed and confused, he stumbled back and rejoined his wife just in time for the Robo Boogers to come to life and smash the fake Combinatron 2000. Meanwhile, George and Harold were running with all their might back to the library, carrying the real Combinatron 2000. "That was so easy," laughed George. "Yeah," said Harold, "we sure got lucky this time." But when they reached the library door, George and Harold discovered that they hadn't been quite so lucky after all. Chapter 14, Miss Singerbrains. "What the heck is going on here?" shouted Miss Singerbrains. "I just got back from the restroom and I found a portable potty in my library." "Harold," said George, "zap her with the forget-you-thingy, quick." "Nobody's zapping anybody with anything," shouted Miss Singerbrains. She grabbed the Forgetchumcallit 2000 out of Harold's hands and yanked the Combinatron 2000 out of George's hands. "I'm taking these things to the police right now," she said. "Maybe they can sort this mess out." Miss Singerbrains marched downstairs to the parking lot, got in her car, and began driving to the police station. "Well," said Harold, "we'll never catch up to her now." "Sure we will," said George. "All we need is some wings." Chapter 15, 65 million years before the day before yesterday. George and Harold grabbed a box of saltine crackers off of Miss Singerbrain's desk. Then the two friends stepped inside the purple potty and closed the door. Quickly, George reset the controls and pulled down on the chain. A flash of green light lit up the room, and the purple potty vanished. Suddenly, George and Harold were transported back in time to the late Cretaceous period of the Mesozoic era, a time when dinosaurs ruled the Earth. Cautiously, George and Harold peeked out of the purple potty, which was now nestled precariously in the branches of a tall tree. "Here, chickie, chickie, chickie," called George. "Polly want a cracker?" called Harold as he tossed a handful of saltines into the air. Suddenly, the two boys were swarmed by hungry pterodactyls. Before long, a friendly-looking pterodactyl, a Quetzalcoatlus to be exact, swooped down and grabbed some crackers from Harold's hand. "Aw, look," said Harold. "He likes me." "Great," said George. "Let's get him into the time machine and get out of here." Carefully, Harold took the pterodactyl in his arms and carried him to the purple potty. Then the boys closed the door behind them, reset the controls, and pulled down on the chain. Suddenly, George and Harold and their new reptilian pal were transported forward in time to the day before yesterday. The door of the time machine swung open and the three friends sailed out of the purple potty, through the library window, and up over the town. George looked down on the city streets until finally he located Miss Singerbrain's car. "There she is!" George cried. "I sure love our new pterodactyl," said Harold. "I'm going to name him Crackers." "Don't give him a name," said George. "We're not keeping him. We're just borrowing him." George, Harold, and Crackers swooped down and landed on Miss Singerbrain's car, which was stopped at a traffic light. Miss Singerbrain screamed in horror. "Wait," cried George. "There's no reason to be afraid. You're just dreaming." "I'm dreaming?" asked Miss Singerbrains. "Sure, think about it," said Harold. "Purple potties appearing out of nowhere, kids running around with laser zappers, pterosaurs landing on your car. This stuff only happens in dreams." "Gosh, you're right," said Miss Singerbrains, "but it all seems so real." "Well, trust us," said George. "In a few minutes you won't remember any of it." Before long, George, Harold, and Miss Singerbrains were all gliding back to school with their good pal Crackers. The Combinatron 2000 and the Forgetchumcallit 2000 were safe once again. Soon they arrived back at the library. "I'll keep an eye on Miss Singerbrains," said George. "You take that pterodactyl back where he found him." "Aw, can't we keep him?" asked Harold. "No," said George sternly. "He belongs in his own time. Now take him back." "Aw, man," said Harold. Sadly, Harold carried Crackers into the purple potty and closed the door. After a few seconds, the time machine disappeared in a flash of green light. A half hour later, another flash of green light filled the room and the purple potty was back. "What took you so long?" asked George. Nothing," said Harold. "Do you have any trouble taking Crackers back to his home?" asked George. Not really," said Harold. "You did take him back to his home, didn't you?" asked George. Sure," said Harold, though he didn't sound very sure. Quickly, George zapped Miss Singerbrains with the Forgetchamacaw 2000 and jumped into the purple potty. Then, with a quick flash of green light, they were gone. Chapter 16, back to the present. Mr. Melvin was very happy to see his purple potty return to him, and even happier to see his beloved Combinatron 2000. Now all I need, he said with a sneer, is to find Captain Underpants. Fortunately, Captain Underpants, who you'll probably remember looked just like Melvin Sneedley, wasn't too far away. Unfortunately, he had spent the last 2 days getting himself into trouble. First, he started out by annoying some old ladies. Captain Underpants had been helping them across the street when he heard a little girl crying for her kitten, which was stuck in a tree. Captain Underpants rescued the kitty, but forgot about the old ladies. "Hey!" shouted one of the old ladies. "That flying kid just left us up here in this tree. I'm gonna get that kid if it's the last thing I do," said the other old lady. Next, Captain Underpants was soaring above the football field when he encountered an unidentified flying object. It was made of brown leather and had white stitching on the side. Said Captain Underpants, "this could be a dangerous UFO." He grabbed it and flew down to the school football field, where oddly, the school's football team was having a big game. "I don't want anybody to panic," Captain Underpants shouted, "but I just captured this UFO. I'm going to take it to the moon where it can be safely destroyed." Suddenly, the players from the visiting team tackled Captain Underpants, which cost the home team 50 yards and the game. "That kid just made us lose our biggest game of the year," shouted Mr. Meaner. "I'm going to get that kid if it's the last thing I do," snarled the quarterback. Finally, Captain Underpants got on the bad side of some skateboarders in the park. He had politely pointed out the no skateboarding signs, but the skateboarders refused to go away. So Captain Underpants had no choice but to snap their skateboards in half with his kung fu kicking action. Then it was spankings for everyone. "Dude," cried one of the skateboarders. "That little dude just like dude our dude boards." "Dude," said another skateboarder. "I'm gonna dude that dude if it's the last dude I dude." Chapter 17, The Big Switcheroony. Mr. Melvin ordered George and Harold to stick their heads out the window and call for Captain Underpants. Soon the waistband warrior appeared. Mr. Melvin welcomed the Cape Hero inside and asked him to pose for a photo. "Why, I'd be delighted," said Captain Underpants. "Great," said Mr. Melvin. "Put these clothes on and stand over there." At first, Captain Underpants was reluctant to put on clothes, but he finally agreed. Mr. Melvin, who had worked all afternoon reconfiguring the Combinatron 2000, pressed the start button, then ran and stood beside Captain Underpants. Suddenly, the two glowing lasers began encoding the DNA of the two subjects it was about to combine. Then, a burst of brilliant red light shot out of the Combinatron 2000 and formed a ball of energy between Captain Underpants and Mr. Melvin. They both slid together into the red light and formed a giant glob of fleshy goo. The newly reconfigured Combinatron 2000 then switched polarities and began the process of separating the two human elements. The red ball of light slowly changed to a lovely shade of green. Zap! Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, a quick puff of smoke, and it was all over. Everybody's brains were back where they belonged. "Wow, that sure is a weird camera," said Captain Underpants, who now looked exactly like Captain Underpants. "Can I take these clothes off now? They're bad for my image." "Go right ahead," said Melvin Sneedley, who now looked exactly like Melvin Sneedley. Finally, it looked as if everything was back to normal, but, as we all know, looks can be deceiving. Chapter 18, The Return of the Ridiculous Robo Boogers. Just then, the Poopsie space shuttle landed at Pico International Airport. It wasn't the smoothest of landings due to the fact that 3 robotic boogers had just eaten most of the shuttle's tail fin and nearly all of its rocket thrusters. Major Tomsky and his crew had barely escaped with their lives. Inside the school library, Captain Underpants heard the astronauts' panicked cries coming from the airport. "Just looks like a job for me," he shouted, and with a mighty tra-la-la, he leaped out the window and fell 3 stories to the ground. Crash! George and Harold screamed and ran downstairs. "Captain Underpants!" cried George. "Are you okay?" "Speak to us!" cried Harold. Captain Underpants slowly lifted his head in confusion. "Mommy," he said weakly, "my train went swimming in the piano." Meanwhile, over at Piqua International Airport, Carl, Trixie, and Frankenbooger had just finished eating the space shuttle and were now starting to munch on the control tower. The three globby gluttons grew bigger and bigger with every enormous bite. "Come on, Captain Underpants," cried George. "You gotta save those people." "But I forgot how to fly," Captain Underpants said sheepishly. "You didn't forget," laughed Melvin Sneedly, who was now floating above their heads. "You just lost your superpowers. But don't worry, they've been safely transported to my body. Now I'm the world's greatest superhero." "Melvin," cried George, "those Robo Boogers came back to Earth. They're attacking the people at the airport. You've got to help those people." "I'm not doing a thing until you guys change that comic book," Melvin said. "And you better make me look cool this time." "But there's no time," cried Harold. "Those people need your help now." "Well, you better start drawing then, Art Boy," said Melvin. Chapter 19. Never underestimate the power of underwear. George and Harold begged Melvin to use his superpowers to save the day, but Melvin continued to refuse. Finally, Captain Underpants stepped in. "You may have taken away my superpowers," the waistband warrior said, "but I still have the power of underwear on my side, and nobody can take that away from me." Captain Underpants turned and ran toward the airport. "Melvin," cried George frantically, "if you don't do something, those boogers are going to kill Mr. Krupp." "That's not my fault," said Melvin. "You're the ones who wrote that stupid comic book about me. Now change it, or else." George and Harold looked at each other. Their choice was simple: either fight with Captain Underpants and probably die, or give in to the dark side and live. The two boys turned and ran to the airport. Chapter 20. Booger Brunch. George and Harold quickly caught up with Captain Underpants. Soon they were all at the airport, witnessing the carnage of the ridiculous Robo Boogers. Captain Underpants shouted a triumphant tra-la-la from below. Suddenly, the three Robo Boogers turned toward the familiar-sounding voice. Quickly, their laser-guided eyeballs zoomed in on three of the heroes who had made their lives so miserable back in Chapter 1. Immediately, the Robo-Boogers leaped at George, Harold, and Captain Underpants, and the chase was on! Again! Chapter 21, Cornered! The Robo-Boogers continued chasing George, Harold, and Captain Underpants, until at last the three frightened friends were cornered at a local shopping center. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, the three brave heroes began taking items from the outside sales bins and throwing them at the snarling beasts. George grabbed a pair of low-fat tennis shoes and tossed them at Trixie. Trixie gobbled them up. Harold found a delicious tube of wild cherry-flavored emerald ointment and flung it at Frankenbooger. Frankenbooger swallowed it whole. Captain Underpants picked up a genetically modified organic orange-flavored orange and chucked it at Carl. Carl chewed it up with a smug grin. Suddenly, Carl's laser eyes grew incredibly large. The haughty smile on his face turned into a panicked gasp as the wet, gushy snot that covered his body began to dry up and crumble. Huge, crispy booglets shot off of his smoldering robotic endoskeleton like green popcorn. "What's going on?" cried Harold. "It's the oranges!" cried George. "It's got to be the vitamin C in these oranges. It's combating the cold and flu that caused the boogers to turn evil." Carl thrashed around brutally as more and more of his disintegrating body cracked off and fell to the ground. Finally, the lights in his panic-stricken laser eyes slowly went out. He stumbled over and crashed horribly into the parking lot. Carl was dead.